So my name is David Germano from the University of Virginia, and I'll be chairing today's panel on Tibetan Buddhism in the Modern Academy. Tibetan Buddhism has been a rich programmatic focus for higher education in North America since the 1960s. It began with programs at the University of Washington, University of Wisconsin, which then continued with the University of Virginia in 1973, and over the years has gradually expanded to include about 20 different programs that offer graduate degrees focusing on Tibetan Buddhism from different vantage points and different disciplinary foci, including Columbia, Harvard, Naropa, Maitripa, Chicago, Michigan, University of California at Santa Barbara and Berkeley, Emory, and elsewhere. Likewise, Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan studies has remarkably expanded throughout Europe and also in Asia, both in the diaspora community with the Central Institute of Tibetan Studies first and foremost, and in China with its various nationalities universities. Tibetan Buddhism is taught primarily in religious studies departments, philosophy departments, anthropology departments, and area studies departments in terms of degree programs, but also can be found as a component of courses or graduate programs in a wide variety of other disciplines as well: education, architecture, art history, sociology, economics, political science, computer science, nursing, medical schools, business schools, law, and in other nooks and crannies of the Academy. Today we have gathered 6 distinguished scholars and administrators to reflect on these 50 years of development of the study of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet in the Modern Academy, with a focus on our fourfold academic mission: research, teaching, publication, and engagement. So we'll be talking about past accomplishments, but also future possible directions on what we have become and on what we might yet be, if we have the vision and courage to question our own past limitations and future possibilities as individuals, as programs, as disciplines, and as institutions. So in terms of logistics, we will start with 2 20-minute keynote talks by Klein and Geshe Lobsang Tenzin, which will be followed by 5-minute thoughts offered by Geshe Ngawang Samten, Sara McClintock, Daniel Perdue, and Yangsi Rinpoche. And then I will make some very concise final comments, and then we'll turn it open to the floor for comments and discussion. So I'm going to keep the introductions short, since I think most of our speakers are well known to all of you. So our first speaker today will be Klein, who's been one of the most prominent experts on Tibetan Buddhism over the last 3 decades, with a long list of impressive scholarly achievements. And one of the most impressive aspects of her scholarly record is her mastery of 2 very distinct traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, which, due to their difficulty and complexity, usually involve very different bodies of scholars in the Modern Academy. On the one hand, Buddhist epistemology and philosophy, and on the other hand, Buddhist Tantra. Her major publications include Unbounded Wholeness, Dzogchen, Bun, and the Logic of the Non-Conceptual, Meeting the Great Bliss Queen, Buddhist, Feminist, and the Art of the Self, Path to the Middle, Oral Madhyamika Philosophy in Tibet, the Spoken Scholarship of Kensur Yeshe Tupten, and Knowing, Naming, and Negation, a source book on Tibetan Sautantrika. We just covered a very large landscape there with those 4 titles. So she's also been active outside of the Academy on issues relating to Buddhist knowledge and practice, with the founding of the Dawn Mountain Temple, Tibetan Buddhist Temple, and the Dawn Mountain Community Center and Research Institute. So please join me in welcoming Klein.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Greetings, everybody. We really are a community now, those of us involved in Tibetan scholarship. In the old days, we were just weirdos. And now we have so many friends. It's just extraordinary. I'm just overwhelmed, particularly by what Emory has accomplished and what you've done to take the field forward and allow us to have this conversation. So it's quite a charge, really, to think about the possibility of Tibetan studies at this moment in the 21st century, with all of the technical virtuosity that's available to us, with all of the political fractiousness and contentiousness and challenges that we face. And I really hope that this conversation will spark some new ideas. I'm only able to offer what I've been able to think myself, and I'm very aware that it's quite limited, and I hope that it will be part of a developing and rich conversation. The first thing that came to my mind, actually, when I started to think, well, what will I say to this topic, suddenly I remembered one of my, or perhaps my very first audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in about 1971. And I went in the way that one could in those days and asked some very naive questions, surely, about Sautrantika or Madhyamaka or something like that. And the ineffability of wisdom came up as a topic, and how it really, you know, you couldn't express it, you couldn't know it, Masam Drime, Sherapaljan, and so on. And then His Holiness leaned forward and he said, you know, it's not that inexpressible. And that has stayed with me, as my students know. It comes up every once in a while, and I thought, why is this coming up for me so strongly now in this, as I think about this talk? And I realized that what I want to talk about is the danger of things in the Tibetan tradition being or remaining inexpressible as our culture comes into conversation with, in deeper and deeper conversation with Tibetan culture and all its aspects. Things seem inexpressible when they can't be heard through the grid or the lens through which we are currently thinking. And there are many, many very important cultural concepts in the Tibetan traditions that don't map neatly onto Western, either scientific or psychological or generic cultural mappings. And I think it's our job, among other jobs in Tibetan studies, to be aware of this and alert to this and make sure that they don't go unexpressed and remain invisible. So before I give a few examples of what I mean by this kind of inexpressibility or danger thereof, let me say something about a broad picture of Tibetan studies, which will not include everything, much as I'm trying to be inclusive. I see it as potentially divisible into two very large areas, which I'm momentarily calling the historical and modern Tibetan studies. And by historical Tibetan studies, I certainly don't just mean history, but I do mean delving into Tibetan culture through its texts, the old philological enterprise, translating texts, getting learned scholarly oral commentary on texts, recording it, all of the great digital enterprises, of which David is a foremost actor in that venue, of cataloging texts, marking texts, everything that has to do with going into what we have of Tibetan culture, the people and the texts, but also the relics, the art, all of that kind of study. And this kind of work would ideally include all of what we are now calling, His Holiness is now calling, the Nalanda tradition. And also, this should include, therefore, study of artifacts and texts and so on that have been held not only in traditional cultural Tibet, by which I mean Utsang Kam and Amdo, but also areas outside that, like Mongolia, as we've been hearing about, like parts of Russia, like China, like Taiwan, areas that have in fact held aspects of Tibetan Buddhist culture for a long time. So this means that students of Tibetan studies who are interested in that kind of historical work will also need to know other languages besides Tibetan and Sanskrit, but some of us need to know Mongolian and Russian, Chinese and or other Central Asian languages, and there have always been a few people who master these, Japanese, but I'm thinking mainly now of Nalanda Buddhism, so I'm naming those languages. We need people and we need universities to continue to support this kind of study, which in some areas is getting to be a little bit of a challenge because the modern conversation is so exciting, and that's the good news. But it's important to realize that we need this on, such a tiny fraction of Tibetan materials from Tibet, let alone Mongolia, have been translated, that we need to continually bring forth new material that potentially can enter this conversation. We can't stop translating and studying text by any means, so we need universities and government grants and so on that will support that work. So modern Tibetan studies then, by that I mean the study of Tibet and Tibetan cultural areas or places that have become Tibetan cultural areas in the last 50 years, and especially the changes, hardships, creativities, and interactions, new cultural categories developing within and among the Tibetan peoples and their interactions with Western or other modernities. So then in the modern context, fueled by an awareness of the past, I want to say that we also find a moral and a political responsibility to, as the Tibetan culture comes into increasingly deep conversation with modern culture, we can't help but realize from yet another angle that Tibetan culture is at risk. And therefore, we in Tibetan studies have a responsibility to think about that. And what can we do about that, whether politically, and politically may mean speaking out, or it may mean not speaking out, so that we can maintain back channels. Financially, what can we do to channel resources to support Tibetan communities in exile, in Sitchin Kham and Amdo, which are now Sichuan, and also let us not forget the Tibetans inside Tibet, who are also struggling to support and maintain their culture, and it is very difficult, virtually impossible, without risk to them actually, to help people inside Tibet, but still we must not forget them, and eventually we must find ways to help this community of which we are a part. So we have this very rich situation of much study yet to be done in the historical context, many fabulous conversations between Tibetan culture and particularly science and other areas as well that are ongoing. So what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful. We need it. We need more of it. It's tremendously exhilarating to see that these conversations can occur, they're fruitful, they're motivated by the very core out of which the Tibetan tradition arises, the intention to benefit beings. And at the same time, we in Tibetan studies must remain aware that there are some things that, unless we're very careful, will remain inexpressible, will remain invisible, will become swamped by the dominant narrative. Science is a very prominent narrative in the West. And while in a very wonderful way, in a certain sense, this, for example, in this conversation in Emory, in Mind and Life and so on, to a degree it's a conversation between equals, but to a degree it's really not. This is North America. The scientific model and also our cultural ideas of what self and body and mind is are way more powerful than, Tibetan cultural ideas. So what are some of the things that we might miss? Is something I want to mention. We know that, well, at one level, there's differences in coding of feelings. For example, His Holiness says, "It is possible to have compassion without attachment, and similarly to have anger without hatred." Now that's a really important point. Therefore, His Holiness goes on, we need to clarify the distinctions between compassion and attachment, between anger and hatred. Now, my point is that this important point is not just a matter of English translation. It's actually a difference of cultural categorizing. When we speak of anger in English, we mean a whole range of things. We can mean I'm nervous, I'm frustrated. It's unbearable to me that people are starving all over the world. It makes me angry. People will ask teachers, is it okay to be angry because, people are hungry? That's not what anger means in this context. Anger means to harm. So we just have a broader cultural category of kind of generic frustration. I'm not sure, well, I guess evil intent would be as close to the Abhidharmic, encapsulated definition of anger, when you intend to do harm to someone. That's a relatively simple example, but a lot of conversations have faltered on that very rock of that discrepancy of understanding of what we're really talking about when we're talking about anger in the Buddhist context. Then there's the body. Sooner or later, we always end up talking about bodies, and it seems important to understand that Western and Asian, including Tibetan, basic cultural background of the body is really quite different, It has been observed that modern Western medicine in particular, learned a great deal of what it knows about human anatomy by dissecting cadavers, looking at the dead body, seeing where the organs were, understanding their relationship to each other physically, geographically, you might say. Whereas in Asia, the main study of medicine, and this definitely applies to Tibet, was observing the live body. Well, the live body's got energy in it that is moving. It has flows that are very significant for health, also very significant in meditation practice. Now, in science certainly recognized that blood flows and that things, there's flows in the brain that can tell scientists something about what parts of the brain are activated. So of course some kind of flowing is recognized in the West, but really the extent to which the category of prana or chi or lung, is important is very different. And this leads to, this is probably known to all of you, but this leads to a potential for different kinds of invisibility. First of all, the whole category of prana, energy, is not a well-formed category in the West. It's hard to talk about it without sounding New Age or very, very vague. And yet, if we're going to have a deep conversation between Tibetan and modern culture, we need to understand this. Because once the body is a dead body, it most easily becomes an object, and it most easily becomes something that is to be observed by the mind rather than in interactive conversation actually with the mind, which is what meditation involves. When we meditate, I was very interested, one of the speakers yesterday mentioned that as part of the training, the cognitive training in, I think it was the cognitive training in compassion, one was also instructed to notice the feeling around the heart. Now that's very significant. But again, with a different understanding of the body, one could be encouraged to feel the flows throughout one's body as one meditates on compassion, to feel what's going on in one's arms and legs and neck and so on as one interacts with another person. And this is another point of potential invisibility. We know that in Buddhist culture, in Hindu culture, darshan, going to see the Lama, as we've all just been blessed to do, is something that people really want to do because of the sense that there's an impact. There's blessings, there's chinlap, there's waves of grace, that just to be in the presence. And from a Western set of categories, this could look like, folk superstition, or just kind of, people are sort of dumb but traditionally faithful. But in fact, if we look at Tibetan, in particular, cultural understandings of the body, of prana, of the fact that bodies impact each other, that our energy is affected, as was stated, by other energies. We heard a wonderful talk the other day about how even apes and many mammals and other animals mimic each other. We know about this in the West, but we don't take it deeper than kind of surface imitation. There's a profound inner kind of rejuvenation that can occur in the presence of a particular person. And knowing this and keeping this in mind, right, that may eventually translate into a different kind of conversation with science. What if there was an experiment where you measured how quickly people progressed if there was a very highly realized teacher present with the group, even if they're just present for a particular meditation session? That kind of question is, latent in, for anyone who understands this aspect of Tibetan Buddhism or of Asian culture. And we also understand, therefore, so this is different from mirror neurons. It seems like mirror neurons are saying something similar, but, and Dan Siegel talks about the debunking the one skull theory of the brain, that now it's recognized that our brains impact each other, which is a huge sort of step forward from the point of view of Asian traditions, who have always known this, but in a way that is palpable. you can't feel. Dan Siegel says he can, but no other human being that I personally know, and I myself, I can't feel my brain exactly, you know, but I can feel, and you can feel, you know, how your energy shifts when you meditate, when you're with someone, whether it's tense or relaxed. It's not just a surface kind of a thing, a surface kind of imitation of, you know, legs moving in sync, or Blair walking like a cowboy when he's hanging out with Bush. You know, there's something more going on there too. There's something that the prana is shifting. And that would never come up if we don't bring it forth from out of the cultural Tibetan tradition. It's not a not yet anyway, I think. It's not a natural conversation partner. It's the kind of thing that could become, I'm just using it as an example of the kind of thing that could become invisible because it's not a direct match for the dominant conversation. And the whole relationship, therefore, once mind-body gets split off, thought and emotion also can get split off. And I have 4 slides that I thought I'd show. Can I do that? Where do I? Okay, we've heard about this already. A very, very important aspect of meditation teaching in some of the Tibetan traditions. I'm talking here about Jegom and Jogom, reflecting meditations, thinking with effort, with cognitive language, all being seek happiness, may they find it, for example. And then, as is taught by some of my teachers, when you really, you know, you read Shantideva, you read Chandrakirti, and so on, and then you think, and then you get a hit, and you realize, oh my God, yes! You know, it's not any, you can feel it in your body. And then, which Westerners need to know that that's an option, because again, that's not an easily or automatically received category. And then you go to Jogom, settling meditation, just sitting in that heartfelt intention. You move from language to no language, from effort to effortless. Now, this is very familiar to many of you, I'm sure. The reason I introduced it is to notice, as observers of culture, that this is already quite a different, speaking from quite a different cultural perspective than, let's say, the Cartesian West. You know, I think, therefore I am. Thinking and emotion being considered in a certain high cultural cult texts, coming through Descartes and Locke and the Protestant Revolution and so on, that thought and feeling are so different. And here we have a teaching that is actually very easily experienced if you sit down and experiment with it, as many students are doing, taught by the Emory and Stanford and other groups, that in fact you can use thought to further and sustain a certain kind of feeling. But ultimately, compassion is, ideally, I think, will have, you know, a feeling tone. I'm going to come back to that in a minute if I have time. So I wanted to mention that to say that when we have this kind of discussion, it's good to notice that it's going against the cultural grain and of Western culture, and just to make that conscious and see what kinds of questions come out of that. Then, you know, there's a whole other world involved in the cultivation of compassion in Tibetan culture, and I know you know this, and it's a little embarrassing to bring it forward, but again, my point is to give examples of things that could be lost if the modern conversation with Tibetan culture becomes the governing force and what kinds of things of Tibetan culture are studied or noticed. So this is a Tara temple in Kham. Tara, of course, born from the teardrop of Avalokiteshvara, a very tender sort of compassion, framed not only by mountains, which give a certain energy inevitably to any kind of practice or activity in Tibet, and all those prayer flags. Those prayer flags also really are integrated into a rather coherent cultural view, which involves not only an understanding of energy, as I've already said, but also an understanding of something called la, we can say vitality, and a very subtle discussion which, again, introduces categories that don't, we talk about mind, we talk about consciousness, as Holiness said earlier today, well, mind, it's not just one thing. Indeed, it's not. And so in Tibetan culture, for example, we have some very subtle categories, just to name one set of la, which we can call vitality, of sok, which we can call life, which ends when you die. La can go in and out while you're alive. And then there's consciousness, sheba, which will go on after death. So this isn't mapping onto Western culture, but that doesn't mean we should lose it. We must not lose it. And all of these have to do also with principles of cultivating compassion if one uses the energy of compassion, the visuals of compassion. I just had this in here to remind us of the mimicry, right, is such a, which we heard this weekend also, is such a deep, even an infant, 2-3 weeks old, will imitate an adult. And of course, in some kinds of practices of compassion, we not only emulate, perhaps unconsciously, the compassionate transmission of energy from a realized, at least a highly developed teacher who is giving this forth, but we also, as you know, mimic, we could say, the deity, like Tara. This is Tara from the Atisha temple near the airport in Lhasa. And so we're imitating, as it were, Tara, and again, not just with thought, not just with emotion, the Jegong Jogong thing, but also with our whole body, with our whole energy, with our visual field, with all of our senses. There's mantra, there's sound, there's music, there's incense. All of these things shouldn't get forgotten as we talk about the great work that is being done in this conversation. And this is just, again, one example of the kinds of things that you could never hear about if you are looking at Tibetan material only in terms of what is going to work now for this kind of conversation. What else? Well, then on Dakini Day, a rainbow appeared. How about that? This kind, which in the worldview, as you know, of Tibet, this is, it's not exactly a miracle. It makes sense. It's like a response from the environment to something, because again, once we have these connecting energies, it makes sense that the environment in some way responds to there are prayers going on all day, I'm told, and so this is a conversation between the humans and the environment, which is some way reflecting the conversation between individual practitioner and Tara for the cultivation of compassion. So that is just to say, again, and I'll close with this, that the two kinds of Tibetan studies that I mentioned, these really very broad terms of historical kinds of studies and what I'm calling modern or modern conversational studies, they absolutely need each other. They will enhance each other. Tibetan studies must find a way for both of these to move forward. They're a natural synergy, and this also brings us to a place to ask again the question that we start with, really, in this moment when there is so much opportunity by way of interconnectivity among our various communities. We can be in touch with people in Mongolia and Tibet and China and so on, Nepal. What can we do now that's different, that we couldn't do before, that will take this field forward in a new way, in a good way, and carry out its ultimate purpose to be of benefit, and to part of that benefit accruing also to the ongoing strength of Tibetan cultural communities themselves. Thanks.
Our next speaker will be Geshe Lobsang Tenzin. Geshe Lobsang Tenzin first studied for years in the Tibetan monastic system, receiving the highest monastic degree of Geshe Larampa in 1994 from Drepung Losang Monastery in India, after which he went on to complete an entirely separate academic curriculum here at Emory University to receive a PhD with a focus on the interface between modern science and Tibetan Buddhism on human emotions and health. In his professional life, unlike most people who have these kind of bifurcated backgrounds, he remarkably has been able to maintain both sides of this background. On the one hand, by acting as founder and spiritual director of Drepung Losang Monastery, Inc. here in Atlanta since 1991, while also acting as senior lecturer at the Department of Religion and director of the Emory-Tibet Partnership that we've all been learning about for the past couple of days. In this capacity, he has worked extensively on the impressive array of exchange and collaborative programs that link Emory University with Tibetan institutions of higher learning, especially in India, while also leading an equally impressive array of research programs on the connection of the mind with physical, emotional, and mental well-being, and the scientific assessment of how Buddhist ideas and practices might have transformative roles to play in these realms. And we've all, as I said, been witness to the fruits of this remarkable work and partnerships over the last 3 days. So please join me in welcoming Geshe Lobsang Tenzin.
Thank you, David. Good evening. And first of all, let me really express my gratitude to all of you for joining us in this conference here that coincides with His Holiness the Dalai Lama's visit. I hope that you were able to attend some of the events with His Holiness, and it was an incredible experience for us, and there will be a lot for us to kind of think through, digest for some time. Let me begin by thanking our chair, Dr. David Germano, and my fellow speaker, Dr. Klein, as well as our distinguished panelists, and all of you for coming and being here today. I should begin my brief remarks by stating that I myself, not an expert in the modern academic study of Tibetan Buddhism. Although I received my doctoral degree here at Emory University, it was not in Buddhism, as David mentioned, or philosophy, Buddhist philosophy or Tibetan studies. Rather, my dissertation at the Interdisciplinary Institute of Liberal Arts here at Emory involved a comparative study of Tibetan Buddhist and modern scientific understanding of the emotions and their impact on health. Ever since then, although I have worked and taught in a modern academic setting here at Emory University, and do teach classes on Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist psychology, and other topics, my work has continued to involve bridging the Tibetan Buddhist tradition with other academic and scientific traditions in an academic setting. The academic study of Tibetan Buddhism in religious studies is of central importance and will no doubt continue to play a central role in matters related to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in a university setting. Having Western trained scholars in religious studies teaching in tandem with traditionally trained scholars, as we do here at Emory. My colleagues, Dr. Sara McClintock and Dr. John Dunn, as well as Dr. Tara Doyle, that we had the privilege of teaching together, co-teaching courses here. And other universities, like University of Virginia and Wisconsin in earlier times, and the Rice University and many other universities. This kind of the way of teaching together, they do make for a rich and multicultural teaching environment with few obvious parallels in today's universities. Students, faculties, and institutions are all beneficiaries of such kind of the team teaching or the collaborative exchanges among the faculty and scholars coming from different backgrounds. At the same time, it seems clear to me that the role and scope of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in Tibetan modern academy is gradually expanding to include other disciplines beyond religious studies, and also other parts of the universities, the other departments and so forth. I cannot think of a clearer example of this than the role that His Holiness the Dalai Lama plays here at Emory, where his visits and his guidance reach out across the entire university to involve faculty and students from all disciplines and all schools of the university. But the interest here at Emory, and I can only speak from my personal experience of what is happening here, although I know it is happening elsewhere as well, is not solely due to His Holiness as a person, but also very much due to the richness of the tradition that he embodies, that is the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. This is because although the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is, of course, a religious tradition, it is also an extremely rich set of traditions that have great potential for mutual dialogue and exchange with variety of disciplines. Another way of saying this is that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition contains knowledge and modes of inquiry that are religious, as well as knowledge and modes of inquiry that are not in themselves religious. His Holiness spoke of this yesterday, as he has in the past, when he spoke of the division of Buddhist science, Buddhist philosophy, and Buddhist religion, which he has been speaking in this way for quite a bit in the recent years, to kind of really try to see Buddhist tradition as a science, Buddhist science, but also the Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist religion. That's something that's whatever knowledge that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition contains that pertains to the reality we all share can be of benefit to anyone interested, regardless of their religious beliefs. There is no need to limit the sharing and exchange of such knowledge to those only interested in Tibetan Buddhism as a religion per se. To illustrate my point, allow me to outline just a couple of areas where this exchange is already taking place and where I hope it will continue to grow. One of the most obvious areas is that of Tibetan medicine. The Tibetan medical tradition is one of the great traditions of knowledge, and it exemplifies the importance of our ability to make a distinction when necessary between Tibetan Buddhist science and Tibetan Buddhist religion. In the Tibetan Buddhist medicine, there we can see very clearly the certain religious components, as well as there's just sheer science itself of the body, of the mind that Dr. Klein talked about, that the various forms of lung, or the prana, the vital forces, and the whole range of the system of the nadis, or the nervous system, the bindus, the chemical properties, as well as the prana. So here we can see a very clear kind of the science behind understanding the body and the emotions and the mind, that how they are correlated at a subtlest level, that where the mind and those energies are actually seen as integrated or different kind of the phase of the same entity, that this subtle energy and the wind, and then they're related to the 5 elements, that which then is understood that as it grows into the various physical forms of our organs and so forth and so on. So it's in that context we can really see that how the precise observation of the body and the mind in making of health or illness is kind of explained. And of course that in the Buddhist tradition also we see the many kind of the religious components as well. So it would be misguided if, in my opinion, to think that because Tibetan medicine is so deeply connected with Buddhist religious symbols and practices such as the medicine Buddha and the recitation of the mantras, it is merely based on religious beliefs, or it would only be effective for those who are members of the Buddhist Buddhist belief, or the Buddhist who believe in the Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan medicine does contain religious elements, of course, but it also is based on the nature of the reality of our bodies, and its efficacy is clearly not dependent merely upon belief. The modern scientific investigation of Tibetan medicine is therefore essential, as Tibetan medicine may have a tremendous amount to offer to the modern biomedicine. One such collaboration is beginning here at Emory right now. Dr. Ray Shinazi, the discoverer of the most commonly used HIV and AIDS drug treatment, and an expert on the analysis of chemical compounds, is collaborating with Tibetan medical doctors from the Central University of Tibetan Studies in Sarnath to examine Tibetan medical compounds for their anti-cancer and antiviral activities. Geshe Lobsang Samten, the Vice Chancellor of this university in Sarnath, India, just had one very fruitful meeting with Dr. Shinazi just a couple of nights ago to discuss the very concrete plans about how to go about bringing the Tibetan doctors, young doctors, who actually can bring that knowledge to the lab here of this, the most the renowned, or the scientist that is doing this cutting edge kind of research on the medicine, to have the young Tibetan medical scientists or the doctors to actually carry the research on this antiviral and anti-cancer activities of the medicine. This is really revolutionary. I mean, it's not something that we would have expected a decade or so ago. So the things are changing. At the same time, the study of Tibetan medicine must take place with attention to the uniqueness of its own indigenous explanatory models. Like as Dr. Klein mentioned, that we must not merely reduce Tibetan medicine to an inert object of study through a Western or modern scientific lens. And this will involve, no doubt, concepts that are related to Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan philosophy, such as the nature of lung, the prana, or the subtle body, and so forth. And that's where that, as the academic, the field of Tibetan, Indo-Tibetan, or the Indian and Buddhist, Indian and Tibetan Buddhism, as it is growing, that there is the greater kind of understanding and the greater room for us to explore those topics or the concept, those dimensions of knowledge that were not in the past that looked at so closely. This attitude represents a balance that I hope will take hold in each of these exchanges across disciplines, and an integral part of the shift that I believe is taking place, an attitude of genuine mutual respect, collaboration, and exchange of knowledge. Here at Emory University, we're clearly seeing this real kind of embracing, at least with openness, not necessarily kind of taking it as a factor, but just openness to see how these rich insights that the Buddhist tradition, that the Tibetans maintained for centuries, how that can relate to the understanding that we are cultivating in the scientific field, whether it's the neuroscience or the medicine and so forth, to really see how it goes together. One of the courses last year, my colleague here at Emory, Dr. John Dunn, myself, and Brandon Rosawa de Silva, together with our colleague in the psychology, Larry Barcelow, we taught a graduate course on the Buddhism and the psychological and the Buddhist perspective on various perspectives, that were the emotions and the consciousness, the self, and so forth. And that's where that we saw such an incredible kind of the discussion that is unfolding, that the time is ripe, for such discussions to take place, and it is an exciting moment. And this process involves not just medical science, but also other sciences as well, particularly in the areas that His Holiness the Dalai Lama identified for fruitful engagement: biology, physics, neuroscience, and psychology. Just here in Atlanta and at Emory, preeminent physicists are engaging with Tibetan Buddhism on questions of relativity and the nature of material reality. Psychologists are investigating with Tibetan Buddhist philosophers and contemplatives the nature of cognition and emotions. Biologists are investigating questions on the nature of life and cells in dialogue with the Tibetan contemplatives. This the monastic 6 months that we have here who will be studying sciences in these three areas, biology, physics, and neuroscience, for a year, this is a clear kind of example of that, how a real kind of this interaction is taking place in the academic setting. Interest in anthropology continues to grow, and not just in Tibetan culture, but also in the intellectual traditions themselves of Tibetan Buddhism. We have a number of graduate students in the Department of Anthropology who are actively engaged in the Tibetan Buddhism and its traditions on issues of compassion, the mind-body relation, and the Tibetan medicine, although none of them is in Buddhist studies per se, that we actually don't really have a Buddhist the studies as a studies, or the Tibetan studies, I'm sorry, that we do have a Buddhist studies, undergraduate and the graduate programs, but not as a Tibetan studies per se. But what is happening is that the interest and the studies in the various fields of Tibetan Buddhist or the medicine and so forth is taking place in different departments, not just in religion or something that may happen in the Tibetan studies. We have one faculty member in anthropology, Dr. Chicago Zavadi Silva, focusing on Tibetan medicine, and another, Dr. Carol Wortman, who leads the neuroscience team for the Emory Tibet Science Initiative. In sociology, our colleague, Dr. Corey Keyes, is now investigating the role of contemplative practices, that how it can bolster our positive mental health. This is one of his kind of the areas of expertise. Of course, there are the other faculty and the scientists here at Emory that, for example, in the medical school, the director of the mind-body programs, Dr. Charles Rezand, who has been conducting study on compassion meditation for a number of years. I should note that in the past, questions of appropriation and Orientalism have arisen in the academic study of non-Western cultures, which is one of the things that has happened in the past. While this may still happen to some extent, what I think is especially encouraging about this recent growth of interest in Tibetan Buddhism in universities is that it is taking place on a more even footing. For the majority of these scholars, it seems that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is not merely an object of study, that just to see that an exotic culture with its rituals and so forth, but or a specimen to be placed under a microscope, but rather a tradition of knowledge and inquiry that should be respected, and that can even possibly offer new insights and modes of understanding itself. That is, these scholars from various disciplines, they seem to approach the Tibetan Buddhist traditions not just as an explanandum, but also as an explanans. Even in cases where one would expect this kind of objectification and reductionism to occur the most, such as in the scientific study of meditation, what we actually see is scientists who are genuinely interested in hearing the Buddhist perspectives on the phenomena they are studying, the phenomena that they are studying, even when these are changes in brain chemistry or activity. Some of the scientists at the Emory Tibet Science Initiative luncheon yesterday with His Holiness even raised the question of whether they should learn Tibetan in order to be able to make use of the richer conceptual vocabulary present in the Tibetan when discussing certain areas of investigation like the nature of the mind or the certain concept like the consciousness and so forth. This kind of attitude is surely commendable. Perhaps this genuine exchange and respect across cultural and academic tradition could even become a model for the respectful engagement of other non-Western cultures in the academy. Furthermore, this attitude of mutual respect is especially important because, as His Holiness pointed out so forcefully in our opening session this morning of the conference, Tibetan Buddhism is not just a tradition of ancient text and empty rituals. Rather, it is a living tradition that in many ways has real and direct relevance to our lives, even in modern society. And it is a tradition embodied by individuals who have devoted their lives not only to study, but also to practice. to the essence of the tradition, as His Holiness said. This is reflected in the changing face of Tibetan Buddhist scholarship in modern university. My esteemed colleague here, Dr. Anne Klein, is just one example of many among us who are able to combine rigorous academic scholarship in an academic setting with lives as Dharma practitioners and teachers. And of course, there are many more who actually teach Buddhism and the practice as well, that it's no more considered some kind of, that unholy alliance for a professor to be teaching religion. That the traditional model was that the professors in religion teach about religion and not the religion itself. But that has changed due to the leading scholars and the professors like Dr. Anne Klein. That in other traditions like Christianity, that our colleagues in these other traditions are comfortable with the rigorous academic study of Christian text and practices, while also being leaders and members of their religious traditions. And I hope this trend will continue in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. For if the study of Tibetan Buddhism were to become completely divorced from the basic purpose of Buddhism, that is, elevating the suffering and the improvement of our lives, then, as His Holiness suggested, the study of Tibetan Buddhism would itself become nothing more than an empty ritual. Needless to say, this has nothing to do with, the proselytizing. The very examples I have been citing of scholars from different disciplines who are showing an increased interest in Tibetan Buddhism is proof enough that the tradition has plenty to offer others, whether or not they are Buddhists themselves. Let me conclude by saying that I feel that universities do have an important role to play in the flourishing of Tibetan Buddhism. Certainly, one of the reasons why Tibet was so successful in not only preserving but also contributing further to the Nalanda tradition of Indian Buddhism was the fact that the society endowed the monastic institutions with tremendous human and financial resources. That in Tibet, the monasteries and nunneries, these contemplative communities grew, into very large communities, and because there was a support from the community or the public. This is not the case in the West, at least for the Buddhist communities at present, or in other non-traditionally Buddhist societies. Although the establishment of Western monasteries and nunneries may be a long-term goal, at present they are few and far between. Moreover, even the most successful of Dharma centers do not have a human and financial resources of a university, and many smaller Dharma centers are struggling just to survive. Given this reality, a greater collaboration between Dharma centers and the universities could lead to programs that bear real fruits. That has certainly been my own experience as the director of Tibetan Buddhist Monastery here in Atlanta, and both Emory and Tibetan Buddhist have benefited to no end from the close collaboration between the two institutions, and have managed to establish programs that neither would have been neither one of us would have been able to accomplish on our own. Certainly, these programs that you have witnessed in the last few days at Emory would have been possible without such a close relationship of the university and a real kind of the practicing community. One obvious example is this very conference we are now engaged in. Others include Emory's study abroad programs, its research on the benefits of compassion meditation, Emory's Tibetan language programs, the key instructors for which actually that are drawn from the listening community, Mr. Tsepa Rinzin, together with Dr. Sara McClintock, that they are able to offer these language programs here at Emory University. University may come to play a greater role in the future for other reasons as well. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has long promoted the idea of secular ethics. And this is one of the things that, again, as the Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan monastic tradition, can really benefit from the expertise of the Western universities or the Western community in bringing or in designing and implementing the curriculum in modern scientific studies. At the same time, I think that that there's a lot that modern universities can learn also about developing courses that promote this, what His Holiness calls the secular ethics, basically. That's a way of living that is meaningful and positive, ethical, that is based on compassion. Just yesterday, we heard him implore us to partner with him in the promotion of the idea that the secular ethics is not only possible, but in fact necessary. Emory's President James Wagner has joined in this call today, actually, during the Professors of Office Hour, by designating Emory as a place where one would be able to discuss religion and spirituality openly, and a place that seeks to promote a balanced education of heart and mind. In His Holiness's view, the traditions that are especially poised to do this are the Indian traditions, with their long history of the study and cultivation of samadhi and vipassana. By Indian tradition, meaning that the ancient Indian Nalanda tradition that which studied the sciences of the time, all the 5 major and the minor sciences, not just the Buddhist, but the other sciences. That's such a tradition that is so fully kind of preserved in the Tibetan tradition, has a role to play in holiness. So it has a big role to play. Therefore, we are the ones responsible, those who are engaged in the Tibetan Buddhist studies, by teaching or practicing and so forth. That we have a certain kind of responsibility and opportunity to really to move this forward by through our own expertise and engagement. I sincerely hope that the trends, some of the trends that I've addressed here today, it will continue, in the future to build stronger programs across many universities and academic environments in ways that bring together the strengths of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of knowledge and inquiry with the strengths of the disciplines in the modern university. I look forward to continuing this discussion and hearing the thoughts of our distinguished speakers and panelists here. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we're segueing to our 4 panelists. And so Professor Geshe Ngawang Samten is Director and Vice Chancellor of the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, Varanasi. Prior to this, he was Director of the Research and Publications Division of the Institute, where he was also awarded his Shastri Acharya and PhD from the Institute, as well as his original Geshe degree from the Ganden Shartse Monastic University. He has a number of outstanding scholarly publications, including the Tibetan critical edition of one of the central texts of Nagarjuna and a translation of Tsongkhapa's Ocean of Reasoning. He's had visiting appointments at the University of Tasmania, Hampshire College, Amherst College, and Smith College, and is also a member of the Tenzin Gyatso Scholars Program Advisory Council. The Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies has been the pivotal force for higher education for Tibetans in South Asia for several decades now, and has been absolutely central to the maintenance of Tibetan-specific forms of learning in the diaspora, serving lay and monastic alike. Geshe can thus speak about these issues from the unique vantage point of being both a superb scholar and an equally superb administrator of an entire university that focuses both on Tibetan populations as well as on Tibetan studies. So please join me in welcoming Geshe Ngawang Samten.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Geshe Lobsang Tenzin and the authorities of the Emory University and the Devulon Siling Monastery and the other colleagues and members and organizations who have been involved in organizing this wonderful series of events and giving us food for body and food for thought, which will take quite some time to digest and also I hope that in future there will be very substantial consequences of these gatherings and the events that we have been attending. The topic of this panel discussion is quite large. If we see the present scenario of Tibetan Buddhist studies in the modern age, then we certainly remember the situation of Buddhist studies in general, and particularly the study of Tibetan Buddhism in particular 3 decades back, and the development that has taken place in the course of 3 decades is enormous. And this credit goes to the scholars and the practitioners of Western, particularly the Western countries, which have made a tremendous development in various areas. I often provoke our Indian colleagues when I speak in the Indian community at different platforms. The academic standard that we have in India, in the Indian academic universities particularly, in comparison to the West, it is really lying behind. So when I speak to them, I tell them to look forward and to see the 3 examples they have in front of them in terms of the quality that they should maintain. The first is the Nalanda, Vikramashila, Takshashilas that they had in ancient time. And the second is those countries who have adopted Buddhism in course of time, like China, Tibet, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and many other countries, who have done marvelous studies and who have made substantial contributions in not only preserving the Buddhist tradition, but also in developing the Buddhist tradition further. And the third example is the Western countries. How much in the Western countries, the academicians and the practitioners have made development with such seriousness, as a result of which you can see the high standard of academics and high standard of contemplations and serious meditations that you can see. So the standard that we have in front of us today is a result of the efforts made by the scholars and the individuals who have started working very hard right from the very beginning of Tibetans coming into exile. For example, Klein, who was talking about her visit to Dharamsala and meeting with the Tibetan scholars and having audience with His Holiness. So there are many other similar scholars who have made effort, and this result has been possible because of the effort of these scholars. Buddhism encountering and interacting with various other disciplines is not new to Buddhist culture. Buddhism in the past have encountered and have had very rich interaction with the various other disciplines. You can see in the history of Buddhism and in the history of philosophy in India how Buddhism has participated, and how Buddhism has enriched Indian philosophy in general, the philosophy of all other non-Buddhist philosophical schools, and not only in the area of philosophy, but also in the area of epistemology and logic, and even in the soteriological and the spiritual practice as well. So, because of such a rich interaction, and because of Buddhist contribution to Indian thought system and knowledge system, the Indian logic system, the epistemological system, the philosophical systems, whether you see in the Vedanta, whether you look into the Vaisheshikas, whether you look into the Naiyayikas, there's a very strong imprint of Buddhist contributions in these schools and systems. After 12th century, all these got stagnated because Buddhism disappeared from India, and there was no further development in these knowledge systems and the academic intellectual systems in India. So this very much reflects how much Buddhism was playing behind the development of Indian knowledge system. So now in the modern age, Buddhism has encountered many other disciplines. It traveled outside Tibet. Particularly in case of Tibetan Buddhism, it traveled outside Tibet, and also particularly in the West, when it came, it eventually and gradually encountered with many other disciplines, as we have been listening from the speakers, encountering with the science and philosophy, social sciences, and many other disciplines. Let alone science, even in the domain of philosophy, in the beginning, about 15 years or 20 years back, when for the Western philosophers, Buddhist philosophy was almost non-existent. Because when the Western philosophers hear about Buddhist philosophy, they just start asking questions that, do the Buddhists have some philosophy? Do they do philosophy? In the similar manner, when Buddhist philosophers hear about Western philosophy, they have similar kind of attitude. Do the Western academic system have philosophy? Can they do philosophy? So this is a rich encounter, and which eventually started enriching each other. And Buddhism has really enriched a lot and made a contribution, and it is making contribution these days. So time is almost up. So I'm right at the very beginning of what I was jotting down some of the points I have. So, coming to the skipping many other points, I would like to say that in the modern academic circle and academic atmosphere, there is a tendency of being innovative and creative. Of course, there are rooms for creativity and being innovative. But in Buddhist tradition, as I said, there are rooms, but at the same time, there are certain traditions to be maintained. There are agams and adigams, lung and tokpa, the teaching lineage, the teaching transmissions, and the realizational, phenomena. So, which are based on the teaching transmission, we attain the realizations. So, realizations can be obtained through practice, and in such cases, we cannot be very creative. When we hear about creating new Buddhism, by picking up some elements from many other different traditions, as His Holiness said this morning. That I don't think would work. One has to be very serious about these things. If one ponders very deeply into the tradition and starts studying the very deeper, insightful phenomena of the tradition, then one can understand whether some superficial things can replace these traditions, these profound phenomena. So therefore, I would like to suggest that for such ideas of being very innovative, of course there are rooms, but one needs to be very careful in being creative and innovative. Thank you very much.
So our next panelist is Sara McClintock, who teaches Tibetan and Indian Buddhist literature and philosophy at Emory University, as well as Tibetan language. Sara is the co-editor of the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction, What Difference Does a Difference Make?, a landmark volume of papers on Indian and Tibetan Madhyamaka philosophy. This year, her own work is appearing in the form of a major philosophical study of Buddhist thought, omniscience, and the rhetoric of reason, rationality, argumentation, and religious authority in the Tattvasamgraha and the Panjika, which explores how Buddhist argumentation about omniscience in certain contexts is bound up with complex issues pertaining to reason and authority. She's also been a pioneer in creating new curricular content, first at in Wisconsin and now at Emory for the teaching of Tibetan language in American classrooms, and has also been a key figure in the overall array of innovative programs and events offered here in Tibetan studies at Emory, Tibetan and Buddhist studies at Emory over the past 5 years. So please join me in welcoming Sara McClintock.
Thank you, David. Good evening. Can you hear me? Is it on? No. Maybe I can.
You can change.
It's okay. I just have to go closer. Is that fine? Oh, right. Thank you. I'll try to keep to my 5 minutes. It's a large topic, as Geshe Ngawang Samten said. And so I'm going to only address one small piece, and even that, I'm sure, inadequately. When I think about the topic of Tibetan Buddhism in the modern academy, the areas of administration, teaching, and research come to mind as three basic categories in which we might examine the issue. Now, I'm not an administrator, and most of the time in any case, and thankfully so, but there is a lot to be said there, and there's a great deal to be said about how to advocate for our field with the various administrations, but I won't be speaking on that. In terms of teaching and research, again, there's a great deal to be said. On the teaching side of things, I think primarily of a division into undergraduate teaching and graduate teaching. And I'm involved with both of these here at Emory. And in terms of research, of course, the topic is vast, but it includes problems concerning proper language preparation, materials, some of the great digital work that David Germano and others have been trailblazing on. What I'm going to focus on is pedagogy, teaching, in particular at the undergraduate level and in religion department, because that is my department. But much of what I have to say would probably apply to other forms of teaching, and certainly also does apply to graduate mentoring. I should say about myself that David mentioned my forthcoming, well, my book that's actually out now, which is firmly rooted really in the Nalanda tradition. My scholarship primarily really is in Indian Buddhism, and I don't think that I would be invited to this panel if I weren't a professor at Emory University, but I am very involved in Tibetan Buddhist studies, both in terms of the language work that I've done here with my colleague, Mr. Tebak Rigzen, and others, but also, more importantly perhaps, in relation to my pedagogy, as a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. So when I go into the classroom to teach undergraduates about Buddhism, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism or Indian Buddhism, I don't leave that behind. I remain a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. And so the first thing that I do is I look around the room and I see who's here, who's in front of me. I take my inspiration in this in part from Dr. Maria Montessori, who developed a form of education for young children in which it's a foundational point of the pedagogy to, as she put it, follow the child. Follow the child. Following the child means meeting the child where they are. And to meet someone where they are requires observation, close observation. My goal in teaching is to meet my students where they are and then to see where they need to go, where they want to go. Now, it's an academic setting, so the first thing I have to admit to myself is it's not a Dharma center, and I haven't been contracted to teach Buddhism. I've been contracted to teach about Buddhism. But what does that mean? What does it mean to teach about Buddhism? Well, when I think about that, there's a lot I could say, but one of the things I could say is that to teach about Buddhism is to teach about us. I think that when we teach about Buddhism, we also are teaching about what we might learn from Buddhism. And in order to understand what we might learn from Buddhism, we have to learn who we are already. Now, Anne brought up some very interesting points about things that get lost, things that become invisible. And I wholeheartedly agree with what she said, in particular in the dialogue, the emerging dialogue with various scientific communities. The categories, the epistemologies of contemporary science are so strong that they tend to steal the show. But one thing that's become clear to me is that our own categories of thought are not that apparent to us either, so that it's also invisible to us. Our presuppositions about body and mind, about gender, about religion, about Buddhism, about the academy. And so what I like to do when I teach any topic, but in the case of Buddhism, I think it's particularly fruitful. What I like to do is use this as an occasion for all of us, and I include myself. I always tell my students that I'm learning from them as much as they are learning from me, but all of us to go deeper into a self-inquiry, understand who and what we are. And I think Buddhism is a particularly rich resource for that. So I know I only have about a minute left. So I'll just say that some of the areas in which I've found myself able to go somewhat more deeply with my students have been in the area of narrative. That is, I think that in terms of bringing out some of the cultural specificity of Tibetan Buddhism, we can do that a bit better by looking at stories that are told within religious traditions. And then, of course, as Geshe Ngawang Samten was talking about, philosophy. Asking students to think deeply about questions of self and other, dualistic thinking, the nature of reality, whether there is or is not some kind of fixed identity in persons or things, and to bring that into conversation with their own lives. For me, that has become a very rewarding way to go forward. Just as we would not ask students to read Plato just to master Greek thought, but to think deeply about eros, about the nature of language, about politics. So in the classroom, I think it's appropriate to ask students to think deeply about the nature of self and other, about ethics of compassion. And then on top of it, I do feel an obligation for us to teach some basic facts. Most students can't identify Tibet on a map, so bring in a map. Some of the geographical, political, and cultural aspects of the traditions can be brought forward quite easily, and it's amazing how students will take that on. So using visual culture as well. These are just some of the very few tools that I'm hoping to throw out here as some other ideas for the rest of you. Thank you.
So sorry, I feel like this is dominoes where I'm just, flicking the dominoes one after another, but it's our time constraints. Our next panelist is Daniel Perdue, who's a very well-known scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, who wrote the defining book on Tibetan Buddhist debate practices entitled, not surprisingly, Debate in Tibetan Buddhism. Weighing in at over 1,000 pages, it is a marvelously detailed and lucid exposition of how the most complex of Tibetan Buddhist philosophical traditions, logic and epistemology, play out in the practical arena of debate in a variety of contexts. He's taught at the Virginia Commonwealth University since 1999, where he teaches Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and debate, bringing these alive in compelling ways to undergraduates, as well as teaching on the intersection of religion and medicine and health and global perspectives. So Daniel's an expert not only in the modern academy and teaching of Tibetan Buddhism, but also a major expert on traditional Tibetan Buddhist educational ideas and practices within the monastic environment. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Perdue.
Is it okay if I talk up there? Okay. Right. Thank you, Professor Germano, for your kind words, and thank you, Emory University, the Office of Tibet, Lobsang in America, and the Preservancy. To put together such an event is phenomenal, and I appreciate the activities of all these people to do it. I also want to appreciate your activities, your effort to get here. People came on sore feet, on walkers, in wheelchairs, with effort. So it doesn't arise spontaneously, so thank you. Okay, so one time, 30 years ago, the great Professor Robert Thurman had invited me to participate in the American Institute of Buddhist Studies, which took place that summer in the area of Amherst, Massachusetts at Hampshire College. And one evening we were called upon, Professor Thurman and I shared the stage to speak on the topic of Buddhist ethics. And I was a graduate student at that time. Professor Thurman, the esteemed professor even then, we were walking together to the venue, and I said, I don't really know what to say. And Professor Thurman gave me the advice, well, if you don't know what to say something controversial. So it worked, and I thought I'd follow up on that advice here. You can say, you can choose what you think is controversial. Okay, so dramatic start. It's basically this, an appeal to tolerance. That is tolerance. Now, you would think it would be an easy sale in this community of the modern academy, professors. We tend to be a bunch of lefties, after all. We support tolerance. And Tibetan Buddhists emphasize compassion. So you'd think it'd be an easy sale. And I think it is. But still, I'm going to speak for it. And why would I say such a thing? Look, toward the end of my graduate career, and for about 10 years after graduating from the University of Virginia in 1983 with a PhD, I made 4 main trips to India and Nepal, spent a total of about 3 years there, met many of you there. And the main place I stayed was in Bodh Gaya, which the local people call Buddha Gaya. And there, Buddhists of all lands come to Buddha Gaya. And so I encountered many practitioners, talking especially to the practitioners from Europe, America, Britain, and Australia, and so forth. And it happened over and over and over again that these practitioners, encountering me in Bodh Gaya, would say, "Oh, well, you're an academic." And then they'd say, "But do you practice?" And so this became increasingly irritating to me. I mean, I'm not just the president of the Hair Club, see? But, okay, well, okay, anyway, it became increasingly irritating to me, although I tried to practice patience. And so I sort of started to work this line, and I came back, well, yeah, I practice. You see me walking to the stupa to do circumambulations and so forth, right? And I said, do you ever study? And they said, well, yes, of course, I study. You know, okay, fine. Then I think we're probably similar. Now, okay, so then, on the other hand, here very often with the academy, you see, I have heard stories. I will not say it's happened to me particularly, as from one scholar of Tibetan Buddhism to me as a student of Tibetan Buddhism, you know, one academic to another. But there are stories about intolerance within the academy. That is, people are biased against those who believe. So you see, on the one hand, the practitioner's not respecting me because I'm an academic, and sometimes the academic's not respecting because I'm a believer. You know, I can't get no respect. See what I'm saying? And so that's all you have to do for Rodney Dangerfield. See? End the line. And so I'm just saying, look, there are reports, and I've heard stories, but I won't repeat them. It's okay. Now, from the side of the practitioner, it is okay if they question whether or not I'm a believer. It is okay because they're not writing my checks. They're not. They can, you know, they're just asking, person to person. There's no. They have no power over me. See, from the point of view of the academy, it is not okay to ask if a professor in the department, or a graduate student in the department, or an undergraduate in the department is a believer or not. In fact, it's illegal in America to practice discrimination based on creed. And so this is where I think it's so phenomenal. I mean, so just imagine if your thesis director brought you in and said something along the lines of, well, I hear you've been socializing with people of that ethnic group. You know, we don't really do that. Or I hear that you're living this kind of lifestyle, and we don't really think, you know? The student would go from the professor's office straight to the dean's office and blow up the professor. You know, that sort of intolerance is unimaginable. So why would there be any measure of intolerance in regard to creed? Now, in regard to belief. Now, understand, I'm not saying that a person should be a believer in order to study in the academy. Nor am I saying they should not be a believer in order to study in the academy. I am not pointing out here a difference between believers and non-believers as if this were a new development. That's always been there. What I am saying is that whereas on the one hand, believers tend to be 8 minutes past. This just in, I'm being told 8 minutes have passed, and I have 5 minutes. That is, what I'm saying is that those who believe tend to be tolerant of those who don't believe, at least within the venue of Tibetan Buddhism, and those who don't believe are often intolerant. Now, this is because of a very odd phenomenon in religious studies departments that you really don't find in other departments. And that is, in religious studies departments, very often there are people who don't find value in religion. I'm serious. I'm serious. Now, you cannot imagine a professor in, say, an English department who thought, I mean, okay, maybe they think Shakespeare is overrated or something like that, or poetry doesn't get close to expressing what prose does. But you're not going to find anybody in the English department teaching who thinks that literature doesn't have value. Now, why would it be? And I would say it's because of the God gene, which is present in about 85% of the population, that predisposes us to believe. And in some percentage, on the order of 1 out of 8 people, that God gene is lacking, and they are astounded that the other 7 out of 8 of us don't believe in things that are evidently crazy to them. And so they have a sense that, that we're in the wrong. We believers are in the wrong. So fortunately, both Tibetan Buddhism and the Academy have techniques for sorting out whether or not it's suitable to believe something. Those techniques are called debate and rational discourse. So if somebody has discovered that indeed nirvana is not possible, please write it up and we'll read it. This would be breaking news. We're being told, let us know. And we'll review it and look at it. Now, I think this situation is not going to go away. I think that Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi said very appropriately a few moments ago right here, the Academy will play has an important role to play. That is, ultimately Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhist education must take place outside the Academy, in my opinion, that this ground is not solid to build on. You wouldn't build a skyscraper on sand. And the university, you have to look at where the universities are going. They're constantly changing, becoming increasingly places for training workers. And so what we have here right now, I know time, but is a very narrow window. 60 years ago, you wouldn't have had programs of Tibetan Buddhist studies. We're in a Methodist university, y'all, and so then there developed a period where we can have Tibetan Buddhist studies in the university, but increasingly they're becoming places for training workers. And so there will be a time when, I say, this is my prophecy, controversial if you will, I don't think that we can stay. But look, Tibetan Buddhism will grow stronger, there will be more money, and there could be independent institutes of Buddhist education that are outside of the traditional universities. The preachers at most of the churches around here are trained at Centers for Christian Education, seminaries, right? They may get learning in the university, but they go to their own, right? Okay, sorry, thank you. I apologize for teasing.
So our fourth and final panelist is Yangsi Rinpoche, who was trained in the traditional monastic system for over 2 decades, until in 1995 he graduated with the highest monastic degree of the Geshe Larampa from Sara J Monastery in South India. And he since published a major study called Practicing the Path, a Commentary on the Lamrim Chemo in 2003. He went on from his monastic studies to teach extensively in America and Europe, which culminated in him founding not only a Buddhist center and spiritual foundation, but most relevant to our present conversations, the Maitripa College, one of the very few Buddhist institutions of higher education in the US which actually offers degree programs in the formal study of Buddhism. He continues to be president and professor of Buddhist studies at Maitripa College in Portland, which is working towards becoming a fully functioning accredited university. Rinpoche thus has unique perspectives deriving from this rare experience of having built up a major institution of higher education in the US from scratch, while also possessing exceptionally strong background in traditional monastic scholarship. So please join me in welcoming Yangsi Rinpoche.
Thank you, David. So thank you, all of you. I'm not going to thank you much, because everybody thanked you so much. And anyway, we know very long time. So anyway, it's quite cold here, up here. While I was working to establishing Maitripa College, which is basically, the philosophy of the mission of the college is to run through scholarship and meditation and service. So through that we can educate and establish really the Buddha Dharma very in a root into the individual students in mind. So the mission is kind of like the scholarship and meditation and service. However, while trying to building the curriculum and structure for the college, I'm very new into a Western style of making the curriculum and so on and so forth, but what I'm seeing, the problem, somehow each semester we have to run through all the topics, just like rush. Then we start the next semester and rush. So then that's the style of how it is taught in the Western academic structure. And of course, in the syllabus, we'll give a lot of things to read, but obviously there won't be not that much time. So I feel that is kind of like a weakness into the reason I'm beginning with the weakness this morning is always mentioned, don't talk of praising each other, let's talk from the way we're going wrong. So that's the one point I feel like. Myself, also like in the early tradition, when we train in a so-called, because Geshe or doctor in Buddhist study, we have to go to study 5 major texts, which have to be studied very detailedly and take a time, one way or the other. And the individual need to be sacrificed the time. So also, I think in the future, in the Buddhist study or Buddhist academic study, maybe to strengthen more further, maybe we need to kind of think a little bit carefully, that kind of like a little bit, kind of very surface level of learning, and then, after 2 years, you become master, you get a master's degree, after 7 years later, you get a PhD, so-called, you call doctor. So these things I feel like a little bit need to be one way or the other to find a little bit more, giving more time, and one way or the other. Of course, we are living in a time that individuals need to have to work, need to be supported. So many different, also understandable, but if we able to establish the bar a little bit higher from the to able to Buddha Dharma to maintain long term into West. So we need to kind of like, not so much looking towards the excuse, but really trying to fight with more the challenge. So that's the one thing. And then mainly the reason when I established this Maitripa College, scholarship, meditation, and service, of course, when we become so intellectual, we know we all become so boring. That's quite obvious. Then, of course, in the individual level, you have so many information in your brain, and if you don't try to put into some kind of way to digest, even in the individual level, it doesn't make sense. So therefore, of course, in an academic setting like Emory University, maybe in a Buddhist study, maybe you can't put the session to meditation. But Maitripa College, we encourage individual, whatever topic we discussed every week, and we put in perspective in the meditation, structure, and then individual need to go through group meditation, and then after that, individual also need to bring their own journal, how that's making transformation and so on and so forth. So that's also, I feel like, very important to have that aspect. Then, of course, I think this morning, Lama Pema mentioned that, in Buddhism, we are liking the service aspect. So in Mitripura, individual students need to be partner the existing, service. Like, for example, individual students have to go to serve, like, for example, going to the prison and teaching for them. And also we are starting to work with the Habitat for Humanity to building the house. And, so this kind of really engaging. Now, of course, service we call very inspiring. Yeah, service. Yeah, we need to do things. There's a problem. We need to help. But what we're trying to do in the Mitripura, like, for example, in Christianity, faith to God is the source, the energy to serve. So in Buddhism, we also need to find some source, inner spiritual source, to not so much like this need to be done, so let's go and do it. We need something much more deeper, strength or energy. So for that reason, in a service class, we're really trying to, students to encourage their philosophy study and their meditation. These two energy source, how they're impacting for their service. So really trying to bringing those two to their own service. We're not so much trying to teach or the skills. Skills are not our, where they learn in Mitripura. The basically how, through their time giving the service, we're trying to find, how their meditation practice, not only the pure motivation, and not only that's kind of like do some prayer from the beginning and then kind of like going there. Each time, an individual need to kind of like assess, their process of a service, how the meditation and a philosophy understanding impacting their service. So that kind of things, and basically in the future, the Buddha Dharma to able to maintain really rooted in a Western culture. I think number one, understanding. Without understanding, too much spending into a ritual and meditation, that's kind of like groundless. Now, studying too much and not, spending time into a meditation practice, that kind of useless. So, somehow we have to, now, of course, in not only academic, I think, Dharma centers takes a really big, we have to give a really, the major Dharma centers in the West really made a big impact into the Western society, the Buddha Dharma established. So I think the Dharma center I feel maybe need to be upgraded, their structure and, in a education field and meditation field, and so on and so forth, to get to level into the academic setting. Maybe for the academic setting, maybe it's not, maybe, I'm not sure, maybe possible to bring the practice level out in a Dharma center they does. Maybe possible, I'm not sure. So anyway, those kind of things will help, I think. I pray and I hope will strengthen Buddha Dharma in the West. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I'm left to introduce and restrict myself. So obviously our time schedule isn't quite right, but someone paid for me to be here, so I'll offer you my 2 cents in return. So to introduce myself, I spent my youth and my graduate studies really focused on the most esoteric traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, based in monasteries and retreat centers across Asia. And during those years, I was a profoundly asocial person. I was impervious to all that surrounded me. In some of the most fascinating parts of the world, the only thing I focused on was getting the commentary and getting the esoteric practice. And the air I breathed during those years was full of ideas of primordial awareness and channels and winds and nuclei and mystic practices. And esoteric models of the human body and mind and their transformative possibilities. But then I had the good fortune a long time ago of being hired at the University of Virginia, where I worked with Jeffrey Hopkins and then others at directing one of the largest programs in Tibetan studies in the world. And I had the even better good fortune over my adult lifetime of living many, many years in Tibet itself, where so many of my teachers and friends and family and colleagues and students now live. And the result of those two good fortunes, Virginia and Tibet, the two poles of my existence, over the last 12 years, I've led the world's largest digital collaboration in Tibetan studies, the Tibetan using digital technology on the Tibetan and Himalayan Library. But I've also increasingly worked extensively in China with Tibetan institutions of higher learning, nonprofits, schools, local communities. And my focus has been on the socially transformative possibilities of knowledge, as well as thinking about alternative models of knowledge in higher education, which embraces the centrality of local knowledge across the Tibetan plateau, facilitating the self-representation of local communities and building collaborative networks of knowledge production, dissemination, and use that transgress the boundaries that currently constrain us both here and there and elsewhere. And so I wanted to just raise three topics in my kind of closing comments. One about Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan studies, one about Tibetan Buddhist studies and digital technology, and finally one about engaged scholarship in the study of Tibetan Buddhism. And I will stay within my time limits, which were 10 minutes, not 5 or 20. So the first one, Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan studies. We often make sharp distinctions between the study of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan culture, and there can be a truth to such approaches, but there can also be a profound falsity to them. Tibetan Buddhism took place, well, not surprisingly, in Tibet, in Tibetan landscapes and in Tibetan communities. And every element of Tibetan Buddhism that we look at has constitutive threads that lead us ever deeper into the profundity of those contexts. In Anne's terms, there is an inexpressibility to this profound interdependence between Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan culture and their mutual co-constitution. Thus, ultimately, to understand Tibetan Buddhism, we must understand all of Tibet, and that is a collective challenge which in Tibetan Buddhist studies we must take seriously. The law of interdependence teaches us that nothing ultimately exists independently, and neither does Tibetan Buddhism vis-a-vis Tibetan culture. And so we need, in the academy and the academic study of Tibetan Buddhism, sociologists, political scientists, literary experts, art historians, architectural historians, medical experts, computer scientists, environmental scientists, and much more, all working together on Tibet, collaborating, sharing perspectives, and cross-fertilizing in the study of Tibet. And we have to find ways for these other areas to have access to kind of richer models of the engagement of specificities of Tibet for disciplines that will never be engaged in the study of Tibetan language or extended fieldwork. And in addition to this, we need to appreciate the profundity of local knowledge. There's a profundity and a beauty in terms of the knowledge that you find in a specific place in Tibet and not in a general place in Tibet. And for me, I had an epiphany many years ago when we were doing a field trip project looking at folk music traditions across the plateau in rural areas. And frankly, I had always hated Tibetan music. It always just wore on my ears. And so I wasn't exactly the prime candidate to be researching Tibetan music. And yet when we traveled to these local areas in Basum So and in Sang and in Far Nari in western Tibet, I had this kind of epiphany about the absolute profundity and beauty of these traditions when you encounter them in their place, when you hear them expressing local sentiments and memories and religious aspirations, and you realize that only here and only now would this be taking place. And there was a beauty and a profundity to that that I would put side by side with the beauty and the profundity of my earlier studies of esoteric Tibetan Buddhism. So number two, Tibetan Buddhist studies in digital technology. Digital technology is a force. It's a force for good, it's a force for evil, it's a force for whatever we use it for, but it's a powerful force. And it allows us not only to think anew about universities and higher education and the way we approach knowledge, but to actually pursue different kinds of practices. We can begin to express distributed models of knowledge production, where the tools of producing knowledge and disseminating knowledge and using knowledge are put in the hands of people, which our current model at the universities of elite knowledge production and elite knowledge dissemination that are inaccessible to most people in the world, including Tibetan communities, don't currently access. It also facilitates people then working across these disciplinary boundaries and institutional boundaries. So the kinds of things we heard talking about Imre could become the norm rather than the exception. And people who have profound commitments to Tibetan language and Tibetan culture and Tibetan specificity can share that knowledge in constructive working partnerships with those who will never have such knowledge because of their own disciplinary commitments. It facilitates more collaborative approaches rather than the humanistic model of a lonely individual scholar working on his or her opus. It also allows us to mobilize the dark archives. All of us who are scholars produce an immense amount of materials as a byproduct of our scholarly activity that never sees the light of day, that never is given access to other people, whether it's very granular things, a study of a term, of an etymology, of a place, or extraordinarily extensive things that scholarly presses simply reject out of hand. It also allows us to express that inexpressible, the contextual interdependence of place and people and religion and literature and so forth. It also allows us to open up scholarly publication to other types of knowledge, oral knowledge, embodied knowledge, which is so important in Tibet, in which things like audio-video can do a much better job at conveying than text. Finally, third, engaged scholarship in the study of Tibetan Buddhism. We have an intense obligation, we have an intense debt, a profound debt, whether we are Tibetan or whether we are non-Tibetan, that we incur when we make our careers off the study, teaching, publication, and adoption of the religious heritage of a people who we sometimes forget are still living, still suffering, and still hoping in this world in which we live. And we have to constantly ask ourselves in higher education, are we ethical as individuals, as programs, as institutions in our repayment of that debt, or are we not? And there will always be a discrepancy between those two. And in that discrepancy between what we should be doing and what we in fact are doing, we should find the motivation and the inspiration to dedicate ourselves to thinking more creatively, working with greater investment and energy towards bridging these gaps in ways that make sense in our own private and institutional settings. And so I'd like to offer in close two possibilities that we at the University of Virginia have been exploring, one led by myself and one by my colleague, Tashi Repke, which mirror the two needs of Tibetan communities across the plateau and in diaspora. On the one hand, better lives, better security, better health, etc., but also lives on their own terms and in their own forms, in their own languages, their spaces, their times, their agencies, their architectures, and their values. So on the one hand, we've been experimenting with a project in participatory knowledge, trying to use modern technologies and rapid training techniques to go into local communities and school systems and enable people, students, nuns, nomads, older people, and so forth, to use these technologies to express their own knowledge, to express their own values and their own perspectives, and to enable that global network of knowledge to also be something that supports self-representation by these local communities across sectors and allows them to begin to use these tools to analyze and reflect on their own situation and their own kind of messages. And in my opinion, and if you begin to look at these, I mean, we're not talking about nuclear physics here and so forth, we're talking about human knowledge, that if we engage in these participatory approaches to knowledge, which is not the norm in the academy, what we find is we are not only more ethical as individuals and institutions, but we produce better knowledge. The knowledge in Tibet far exceeds our scholarly capacity to exceed it. Now, if these kinds of approaches result in better ethics and better knowledge, then what is left to not adopt them? Arrogance? Colonialism, the profit margin of our institutions, and number two, sustainable governance, which my colleague Tashi Repke is leading, which involves focusing on these issues, trying to bring professional schools, nonprofits, to address the other side of the equation, which is better education, better health care, better security, etc. And what we could do is begin to involve ourselves in making ourselves available to people who have expertise in these kinds of fields and those kinds of complex knowledge, to bring our knowledge of the language, the religion, the literature, and so forth, the form of beings that make Tibetans who they are and what they care so much about, and to bring those expertises in the service of people who have other kinds of expertise in these areas of governance. So the future requires knowledge and care, the powerful and extraordinarily difficult knowledge of how to build sustainable solutions to complex human problems, and the care to share the plights of those less fortunate, not for a moment, not for a summer, but for a lifetime. And so the final thing I'll say is, since I'm at the University of Virginia, I have to offer quotes from Thomas Jefferson, who founded our university, the third American president. And my favorite quote I see in the airport every time I come, so I saw it as I came to Imre: the important truths, that knowledge is power, that knowledge is safety, and that knowledge is happiness. And yet when I think about that quote, every time I fly out of the Charlottesville airport, I ask myself in the context of Tibet, whose knowledge, And consequently, whose power, whose safety, and whose happiness? Peace, the resolution of human conflict, will come from the intersection of knowledge and care, as we hear so often from His Holiness. But when we care enough to enable and appreciate the sustenance of local knowledge and local being around the world and across the Tibetan plateau, and we view the world as a series of smaller worlds, unfathomable in their depth and unknowable in their complexity. And with that, I stayed within my time limit, but I also expired us with no capacity to offer the floor questions. So sorry. So. So I want to thank to our speakers and panelists in particular, but also all of you who've gathered here for these last 2 hours to discuss these issues of mutual concern, and of course to Emory University and all the other organizations and individuals that have made this amazing event possible and run so smoothly. Now tomorrow at 11 a.m. we will be part of the business meeting, so I welcome any of you to join that part, and I guess the lobby will show you where that room will be and discuss potential follow-up to the discussions we've had today, and we can also talk in more detail. So thanks again for all coming.